Graduate School of Public Service. She's an economist and statistician, been actively involved in the management and linkage of federal, state, and local data, as well as producing new data products. As with the Commission and other efforts, we're continuously learning from the experiences of other countries. This is a large world with a lot of different perspectives on how to handle these data aspects of sharing and inventorying and figuring out what data is simply out there. So why don't I turn it over to Julia? Go ahead.
Oh, Julia, I think you may be on mute.
Yes, I said to say that. Maybe on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you now.
Great. Okay. Thought we got that cleared away before we got started, so apologies. I must have done something in the interim. So before I get started, the normal caveat supply. I've been involved in many of these activities, some of them from the beginning. And what I did was I reached out to people in each of the three countries, Germany, the UK, and New Zealand, and asked them to review these slides, but there's bound to be errors, and I apologize in advance. The errors are all mine. Okay, can we go to the next slide? I'm going to talk about three countries, one in which the UK, in which they started a fair bit before the United States, and they had a number of challenges to which I alluded last time. Germany, which is just now initiating a new activity based on 20 years of experience, of successful experience. And then New Zealand, which has actually implemented an integrated data infrastructure and is using it in policy making. I'm going to give you a little bit of the genesis of this. And then in thinking about this, I thought I'd talk about the context, structure, achievements, and lessons learned. So if we could go to the next slide. So the UK context was, there was a strategy from the equivalent of the Social Behavioral and Economic Sciences Directorate at NSF, which is the ESRC. And Peter Elias was one of the leaders of this. And the essential idea here was there were the same kind of issues that researchers had in, and have been highlighted in the Commission report and also have been discussed by this committee. And what they wanted to do was to figure out how to enable researchers to improve the decision-making in the national governments. And for those of you who remember, there are, while the national government sits in London, in Wall, there are 4 countries: England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And so the Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales are devolved nations. And you can almost think of it as not directly analogous, but has some similarities to state and local. So if you go to the next slide. And I'm not going to read these slides to you. As I always say, despite your American upbringing, I'm going to assume you can read. But that was a joke, Don. The recommendation was they should set up 4 administrative data research centers in each one of the 4 countries. And then they had a central coordinating body that brought those 4 together, and they met regularly. I should say I chaired the IT committee for the 5 years in which it was running, and obviously drew a lot of ideas from that in our own work. And I don't know if Danny Goroff from Sloan and now NSF is in the audience, but I had Peter Elias come over and talk to us at NYU, and many of the ideas that were in the UK Administrative Data Research Network were adopted by a call that Sloan did for an Administrative Data Research Network here in the United States. So if you see parallel concepts, it's very much driven from those conversations between the UK and the US. So you get some sense of the order of magnitude of the investments and kind of the framework. So go to the next slide. This is very dense, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how they organized it. There was an administrative data service, and the data owners, the idea was they would provide the data to the service. There would be a trusted third party. That trusted third party would take and link the data, and it was only for the purposes of the linking. It was not this a massive clearinghouse. And then once those links had been made, poof, the source data would disappear, and you'd only be able to do work on the linked data set. And then you had the research centers in which the researchers would come in and do the work. The basic idea there was that the ministries would have questions in the ministries in each one of the countries. They'd work with the ADRN, and they'd get researchers to try and address the questions. So next slide. So Peter and I set this out. We had a conference that the Gates Foundation and the Arnold Foundation funded in 2017. And we had Peter come over and talk about the lessons learned. And I sent to you that the chapter of the research paper that he wrote that's published by AASP. And, he talks about the achievements. Obviously, one of the big things that came out, you had a secure environment, and they did create networks of researchers. The really key problem, again, to which I alluded last time we met, this is quite a strong statement, the ongoing running costs may not be regarded as value for money. So that's a direct quote. And the big challenge, I think, particularly two of those centres, the one in Scotland and the one in Wales, was based on a long-standing relationship between the academic centre and the agencies. So they had a long-standing relationship, and it just built on that. There were a lot of problems with the English part of the consortium. So I rephrased the language that was used in order to make it acceptable for a public presentation. But there were a number of challenges. And what ended up happening was that the English ministries, even though there was this whole infrastructure that was put in place for secure environments, for governance, everything was put in place. At the end of the day, there was a feeling that the English researchers and the organizational structure in England was not going to provide value to the ministries. And I think that's going to lead into the state and local conversation that we're going to have after this. It's about the value to the agencies. So effectively, what happened is in 2018, they reorganized. They shut down the way in which they had done things. And I think I'm allowed to say I was part of the review process on this, but they reallocated the funds to Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And they took the money, they shut down the English one, completely took the money away. And they reallocated it, and not all of the money, that's not correctly right, but the Office of National Statistics. And so it's not been renamed to the ADR UK. So next slide. So they now reallocated from July another £59 million. So what is that? Probably $70 million, $75 million. There was a national productivity. There was an institutional infrastructure that was put in place, this UK research infrastructure, and money goes to the academic centres as well as to the devolved agencies. So there was some, and the reason I was talking about the relationship to what's going on in state and local, Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Ireland also got funding. And you can see some of the successes if you go on and take a look at that link. Okay, next slide. So the lessons learned. It's not, and I've said this a million times, it's not enough just to build the technical infrastructure. And Amy knows this as well as everyone in the room knows this, the virtual room. It's all about trust. You can't just put an infrastructure in place and say, now you're going to be fine. You've got to build that relationship. You need some strong leadership to make that happen. You can't just put an infrastructure in place. There has to be money behind it. So when you're looking at the state and local government data, there needs to be money that flows to the state and local data. There's been a number of unfortunate documents that have floated around which says that the federal government should just make the states provide the data, and that just isn't going to work. There'll be many, many delays and you'll get bad outcomes. Be prepared to fail and to restructure. So whatever we put in, whatever is suggested, have a mechanism in place for review and enable it to be shut down. And very important thing is to engage with the public. Next slide. And so let's move to Germany. I'm conscious of the time and I don't want to run over. This is something that has just come out. I got the slides, I believe, the moment they were produced, which was a couple of weeks ago. So they're investing in a national research data infrastructure that's not just social sciences, it goes across all the social sciences. And at the core is a 20-year initiative, which is called the ACDEB, which is the German Data Forum. And that is a consistent and long-term infrastructure between the academic scientists and the data producers. So again, we're seeing this theme that what makes it successful is not just academics coming in and wanting to get a research paper, but a long-term trust relationship that sits at the core in which there are activities that are of joint value to the scientific and to the agencies. And out of that sits at the basis, and out of that comes, flows the activities which we're all interested in supporting and engendering. Next slide. Okay, so here's the order of magnitude, and you can see this is part of a broader national activity. It's life sciences and math, physical sciences, and engineering, computer sciences, and so there was funding made available. Again, you'll see the parallel with the UK system. Next slide. And the order of magnitude of the funding is about 90 million euros, so about $110 million. And for each of those 30 consortia, there will be about $70 million, so it's about between 2 and 4 million euros. I happen to think that's a little low, but that is what it is. Next slide. Gives you a sense of the org structure. So you, again, have this link between the operational side, which is the research data centers, which are accredited by the German Data Forum, and then this governance structure, which is the interrelationship between the data producers and the scientists. And so it's the operational and then the trust building, the operational is the Committee for Data Access, which runs the research data centers, and then the trust building mechanism is the German Data Forum. So again, we've highlighted this with a series of one-offs in the American system, building that ongoing relationship where it's a repeated aim. It has been quite successful in Germany. Next slide. The other piece is the community participation, public relations. Again, that's another message that came through in the United Kingdom, comes through in the in Germany as well. It cannot be a set of high priests who disappear, who know what's best for you, and make decisions and send it all out. So, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So that I think is anathema. It has to be community driven. And again, going to the state and local discussion that I know is coming, thinking about how to engage the state and local agencies who are used to working at the coalface. That is one mechanism in which to generate community participation. Next slide. So going from a country where there was very little engagement and very little access to data for researchers, now those 38 research data centers have grown over the past 20 years, been incredibly successful, and those are the key results, achievements. Next slide. So just summarizing it, the community input, data trust, Stefan's been very involved with the data search and discovery, which is the rich context approach, which identifies the value proposition to working with the data in an automated way. So that's a major activity that the Germans are involved in. But strengthen data infrastructure and scientific, transparent decision process. Okay, next slide. So obviously, well, many of you know I'm a New Zealander. So I've been quite involved in the New Zealand integrated data infrastructure. The context for this is that when I was building LEHD, the LED program in the United States, New Zealand asked me to go back and work part-time in the Ministry of Labour. And so what we thought of is we could build something similar in New Zealand, because the same core infrastructure for linked employer-employee data that we used with the UI wage records in the United States and the W-2 data could form the frame for a New Zealand integrated data infrastructure. And the reason I'm setting this up is that Liz McPherson, who later became the government statistician in New Zealand, and I went around and banged on ministry doors and said, here's the value proposition for you. So we did that in 2001. We had an international conference. 20 years later, you have an integrated data infrastructure which integrates data from multiple sources. So this process started later than the LEHD program in the United States. And now New Zealand has an integrated data infrastructure that is being used for decision making. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's involved there and kind of what it buys you. I believe this is one of the slides that I sent out as pre-read, so you've got the information if you need to look at it. So let me go to the next slide. So this next few slides are from Bill English, Sir Bill English, I should call him. I'm not used to calling him anything but Bill, but Sir Bill, who's the former New Zealand Prime Minister. Before that, he was Minister of Finance, so effectively the Chief Financial Officer in New Zealand. And so we started the lead in New Zealand linked employer-employee data in 2001, just to give you a sense. Bill came in 2008 as Minister of Finance, and he saw the value of the IDI and pushed it forward. These are the slides that he presented in New York, and then he also came in and we got him set up to give a couple of presentations both at the White House and the World Bank. So looking at the next slide, so you'll notice here the title is social investment. And the next thing is, these are, as I said, his slides. We need to know what works, for whom, at what cost. That message is a very strong message in terms of the value proposition. And then creating a system that learns. Now, next slide. So New Zealand, and you'll notice that I blotted out the ugly island to the west of us, which will have no name. It's too large and, they're criminals anyway, so we're going to keep them out of the picture. But that's a picture of New Zealand. And New Zealand has very similar structure to any country that you look at: education, health, pension, social security. Next slide. So what did New Zealand do? And what we mean by integrated data here is thinking about how to combine in a secure manner data on individuals. So here's look at look at an individual as they get older, and down at the bottom there is the cost or the spend on that individual. So you've got data on combining data, children, youth, family services, abuse, foster care, education, and so on. So here's a kid being born. So by age 2, they're showing up in children, youth, family services records and findings of abuse. By age, you see the pattern. This is showing up as a flag. Enter education at age 5. And then by the time they're 9, you can see spotty education attendance. By the time they're 11, there's a gap. Findings of abuse, they get taken into care. So you see the pattern of foster care and abuse. And then by age 17, they're showing up in the criminal justice system and in income support. And you can see the cost of that individual just in terms of the taxpayer cost, not the other cost. Next slide. How was that built? So New Zealand started in 1840. So you can see the data actually on mortality events go back to 1840, but you can see all of the other information comes in at different stages, but those are the core infrastructure, very similar to the United States, very similar to, actually, even when I was working for the World Bank, you see similar data sets in Malaysia, Morocco, Madagascar, Tunisia, and so on. Next slide. So, you first of all want to know, what do people think about integrating data? So Stats New Zealand, Stats NZ, commissioned a study, and I think that's available as well, to figure out how do people feel about access to data. And again, I don't need to read this out, but you can see the core ideas of the purpose. And, if you think about the 5 safes, that's the first thing, safe project. What's the purpose? It's not for researchers to get publications. It is so that the agency can serve the taxpayer better. Is it secure? Again, one of the 5 safes. Access, one of the 5 safes, and so on. So each one of these issues are things that I think, New Zealanders aren't that different from Americans. Those are the kinds of things that we ought to be thinking about. Next slide. What's the organizational structure? Very similar to in the UK, to Germany, to what we have in the US. Just about every research facility has something like this. Next slide. So what's the value proposition? And it's really at 3 levels. And I put this slide in there. Bill obviously had a much longer slide deck, because I think we can think about the value proposition at 3 levels. One is a macro level. how much is it costing the country? The second is, how can we think about cohorts of individuals, the old, the young, people, transitioning from out of high school and into work and so on. So thinking about what are the costs of particular cohorts. I'm going to talk about that in just a second as well. And then individuals. And you don't need individual level, you need individual level data in order to do the statistical modeling. But you don't need it to calculate many of the level 1 and level 2. Let me point out that for many of for level 1 and level 2, the impact of shocks, like a change in taxes or a change in pensions, or a discontinuous shock, is typically how you figure out the impact of different effects. And in order to do that, at least in the New Zealand experience, and certainly in my experience in the United States, you need to have information about at the individual micro data, and you need to be able to look at outliers. So I'm going to talk about that next. Next slide. You can provide to the public some sense of how much the access to the data, what the value proposition's been. You can show, by doing this, we reduce the cost to the taxpayer of $14 billion, quite separately from the other activities. And for every policy package, the government agency staff can figure out, if we introduce a new policy package, how much, for example, has child poverty been reduced? Okay, and that again is a discontinuity that you need to have access to the underlying microdata structure. It cannot be captured by adding noise or synthesizing data. Next slide. You're able to look at the cohort liabilities. Again, these are not my slides. These are Bill's. These are the Minister of Finance making the case for why the data and access to data by both researchers and government agency staff has value. You can zero in on your high liability cohorts. Notice those cohorts, those individuals are pretty easily identifiable. Most of the costs are with a small group of individuals, and they're the ones in which you want to intervene. Next slide. You also want to understand risks of individuals within each cohort. So in New Zealand, just like in other countries, if you don't finish your educational qualifications by age 18, you're pretty much in trouble. So you can identify the high-risk students. You can identify the outliers. So when you're trying to think about allocating resources, don't need to allocate resources to my kids and your kids. They're all right. They're going to graduate, or I'll kill them, right? Or you will kill them. That again was a joke. I don't want to go off in handcuffs, but you can reallocate resources to the kids that have a really high risk. And so you need to identify those. Those are the outliers that you need to go after. Next slide. You don't just have to make it in terms of value to the taxpayer. You can talk about reducing social harm. So by intervening early, you can reduce the long-term consequences to individuals in each cohort, which are disproportionately in New Zealand, Maori and Pasifika individuals. And so you're actually able to, if done right, you can have a high impact. Next slide. And I'm going to finish out of this. The data show, for example, throwing people in jail before they're 20 actually has a big negative effect. So this is data driven. What they found was that when you look at individuals instead of aggregate data, you can see that most people actually stop criminal activities quite quickly. And there's a very few people who are career criminals. And so trying to get them off the path can have a big payoff. Next slide. So you can see what Bill is focusing in on here is the value proposition, both to the individuals and to the budget. The importance of being able to combine data across multiple sources, not just looking at convictions and education, but also, medical records can be very, very helpful as well. So again, making the case for integrated data looking across silos. Next slide. So back to the lessons. Again, value proposition is critical. That term social investment is a very important one. I talked to a colleague. How did IDI grow? It didn't grow because of mandate, it grew value. Ministry for Social Development only began using it 3 or 4 years ago, and that the use is just increasing because it has high value. And Tim Maloney and I wrote up a piece on the vision back in 2001 at the New Zealand Economic Papers after we ran that conference. And that vision, you can see how it's worked its way through to the national data decision making. Surveys, I want to say, are still important. The Stats New Zealand, being able to link in survey data to the administrative data is really important. A lot of policy decisions are made. So exactly that calculation that Bill went through in the slide deck, you have to do an analysis using the IDI when proposing policy change. A couple of big issues that Stats is running into, and the academic community. New Zealand's a small country, it's only 5 million people. The workforce capacity gap is a major constraint. Now, it's come a long way in the past 20 years. People are used now, they only used to be able to work with Excel spreadsheets and tabular data because the interpretation of the Stats Act was that microdata were not allowed to be accessed. But a reinterpretation of that in light of the value of the data didn't need legislative change, just needed a reinterpretation of the Stats Act, meant that people could now access the microdata in secure environments in New Zealand. But there's still not enough New Zealanders to be able to do the research work. So building up the training capacity is an important piece. The other problem is there isn't enough dedicated funding for Stats NZ compute capacity. So really tough problems take a very long time to run. Next slide. So we can learn from failure, and there's a lot to learn from, I think, from those 3 countries. I only wanted to do 3. There's more, obviously, that we could talk about. Those are the ones I know best. Value proposition, and again, I'm not going to read through each of these. Value proposition comes in, and that is going to require looking at outliers. That's where the costs come from, and the discontinuities. Small populations, again, that's where a lot of the value proposition comes on, because quite often they're the affected groups. In New Zealand, we went to every single province in New Zealand, getting the buy-in of the regions and localities, and that's important. In all of the cases that you look at, it's not like you wave a magic wand and something happens. You have to be in it for the long term, and you have to be committed. So, and I think that's my last slide. Yep. Okay.
Well, thank you. You did great on time, actually.
I'm very docile, very docile.
So we do have a little bit of time scheduled for discussion. I will just say housekeeping. We'll ask Peter Bonner to speak up a little bit. I'm using a new device where the chat function is not as transparent as on my old device. So I can see them, but it doesn't come up as automatically. So I apologize in advance if I miss you. Other than that, why don't we open it up to the panel in case anyone has any comments. I don't have any one raising their hand. Okay, I have one. Christina has a comment. So why don't we start with Christina? And then Amy.
Hi, Julia, that was great.
Amy O'Hara.
Hi, Don, thank you. Julia, I have a question actually. So I really love your idea of like this framing of this value proposition, but I'm curious because the framing that you presented for us today was related to the value proposition for sort of investors, from kind of a governance perspective and for those that are, decision makers in creating policies and programs. From the public's perspective, how has this, what's your sense about how that value proposition has been communicated to them? Because one of the reactions I'm having to this, the visuals is wondering, in terms of thinking about the translation to this kind of approach to the U.S. about sort of the big brother, the, deterministic models where you are, plugging in and then suddenly we're tracking you for the rest of your life. And
No.
So I'm curious about the public, how the public has been engaged with these activities. And if you could talk a bit about that stakeholder group and with the particularly with the New Zealand case.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there was several responses. So, we have seen in real time almost how when the value is great enough, integrating data can be seen as acceptable, and we've seen that with the COVID crisis, right? So people recognize as a public health emergency. I think we're seeing that a bit with the jobs situation since you're at DOL, right? So I did it a little bit about whether to show that very specific slide which says linking together information. One has to be very clear that that is de-identified. Individual information is not shared. The messaging around that is extremely important because, frankly, we don't need to know who that person is. That doesn't matter. You just need to be able to characterize individual pathways without needing to know that individual is. So, that 5 safes messaging is a very important set of message. There was a lot of pushback in New Zealand around the social investment originally. So it was the subject of a great deal of conversation, both in New Zealand and in Australia, which was trying to emulate it. And that's part of the reason why that report was done about what is acceptable and so on. So I think it's absolutely critical not to try and boil the ocean, not to come in and say we're going to link all kinds of data about everyone. In New Zealand, and certainly in my experience with building the LEHD program in the United States, it's kind of you focus on what's the highest value thing to the highest value agency to start with, and you're going to set up environment that makes that possible. So it's by no means wave a magic wand. It's a very careful process.
Thanks for that clarification.
Great question.
Amy, to you.
Thanks, Julia. That was great. And I have a comment and a question. So my comment pertains to Canada. You've covered a lot of the other countries that are making great gains here. But in Canada, when you look across their provinces, many of them have invested in a really structured use of administrative data. And some of the provinces did exactly as you said, and they built for purpose, and they continue to grow and are really getting greater engagement in answering the questions of government agencies. But then some other provinces did it with the agencies that had the pressing questions, but then those questions fell out of favor and the funding dried up and the lights turn off. So how do you future-proof this so that the pressing questions of today or the next 3 to 5 years, it builds an infrastructure that is sustainable more as it has been in Germany and New Zealand?
That's a great question too. So I didn't talk about Canada because I haven't been as close to the coalface with Canada as I think you have and others. I do. When we ran the initial conference in Wellington in 2001, we actually did have the Canadian Privacy Commissioner come over because back in 2000, they had tried to build an administrative data infrastructure. They'd followed all the rules. They'd got it all approved through the agencies. And then it hit the Canadian newspapers and it blew up. And it shut everything down. And the Canadian Privacy Commissioner was established. And, you know, it set them back 10 years. So we actually had, I think it was her, come and talk about lessons learned from that experience. You know, I think that's something that I'd like to hear from the state and local government agencies about how to proceed. I'm not going to pretend I've got an answer at this point. I think it's something that the committee needs to address. Yeah, because I think you're right, it works differently in different contexts, and I'm not sure you can future-proof anything. You can just take a good stab and recognize you might fail. So I think one of the biggest lessons in the UK is clearly one activity failed and they were able to pivot. So building a structure where you can fail and then recover and build it a different way is an important lesson. I don't think you can perfectly future-proof.
Thanks. We have Ken Trotsky and then Chris Heflin have comments. Ken, to you.
Yeah, so thanks, Julia. That was great. Enjoyed the presentation, and I agree with you 100% that getting buy-in from everybody is of fundamental importance and something that we need to focus on. Yeah, and I think one of the challenges that we have in the U.S. over some of these other locations is we have to get buy-ins from the federal government and then 50 state governments. And so that gives us some, makes it a little more challenging. One of the things that I think in terms of buy-in, at least from my own experience, and I'm sure you have had similar experiences, you know, we haven't heard much conversation, even within states and certainly between states, the ability to share and use government data, state data, is extraordinarily limited. You know, I know in my own experience, I've done work with state administrative data here in Kentucky and also in Missouri, and I'm currently working on a project looking at a training program that goes on in Louisville, which is right on the border. But of course, a lot of the participants also come from the parts of Indiana, which is right across the river. It's easy, there are bridges, so it's easy to get into Louisville to participate in these programs. But we can't get data, outcome data, in from Indiana because we don't have an agreement yet with Indiana. I know your group is working on that, so I appreciate that. But in contrast, in Missouri, when I've worked in Missouri, we always had information for people who lived in Kansas, but not people who live in Illinois, which also presented an issue. So I think, you know, part of the buy-in for states has got to be, look, you know, in order to study your programs, you need to be able to have information from people from surrounding states, and this is something that hopefully this could achieve. But even within the same state, state agencies are, as far as I can tell, no better at sharing their own data amongst themselves than federal agencies are, and so I think part of the buy-in we have to think carefully about, you know, convincing people. Even if all you're interested in is studying your the labor markets in your own states, for many states that labor market includes portions of other states, and it's fundamentally important. You know, any training programs or education programs, people are moving when they leave the state. So to understand the success of your higher education system or your K-12 system or your community college system requires data, particularly on outcomes in other states. But even much of it, even the Department of Education, who wants to study things in the state of Kentucky, struggles to get access to the UI wage record data and information on those outcomes. So I think that's an important key focus that I think we need to make so that we can hopefully achieve some more buy-in. And I'll just add, related to what happened to Canada, the same thing happened in the United States in 1968. We were all ready to launch a data warehouse, and then the whole thing blew up. So we experienced that earlier, and so I think it's something that we do need to keep in mind.
So I think that's right. I am not going to speak for the states. It's very good that we have a conversation from the states after this. I do think the technical issues associated with sharing across state and agency lines have been, to a large extent, addressed. As you know, we built the ADRF in order to inform the decision-making of the Commission. I think it's proven that it can work. What I will say is the challenge with researchers is very often that they there are bad actors among researchers, and so the challenge with providing data to researchers is they go off and they do things that they should not do, and so the agencies lose control, and at the end of the day they're the ones who are on the hook. And so it doesn't do anyone any good if a researcher goes off and does work, and then the first thing the state agency knows about it is when it's on the front page of the New York Times. It is building an infrastructure in which there can be trust and control by the state agencies of the data for which they are ultimately responsible to the taxpayer of justifying what the value proposition has been. I think that's got to be at the core. And I don't think you need to boil the ocean. You start with a few high-value things. I think we need to build a mechanism whereby researchers earn trust rather than assert trust. It's going to be critical.
Well, that is a bold statement for the researchers in the community. Well, I think we've experienced that a little bit in the past. So hopefully we'll hear a lot more about that. I don't know an agency
that has not. That's the problem.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll hear more about those challenges in the next presentation. I wanted to turn it over to Chris Eflin now for the comment.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Julia, I'm representing what we call in the federal bureaucracy performance management. That doesn't really mean the individual, the programs. So the job of the performance manager is using data not so much as a means of evaluation to make it the impact we wanted, but are we on track to execute as we had hoped? We're on track to achieve the outcomes we wanted. To do that, we haven't been able to date, I think partially out of ignorance, use our own statistical...
It's very hard to hear you.
Okay, let me see. Is this a little better? No, I'll turn off the video.
Marginally.
Okay, I'm in Salt Lake City, so...
Much better.
Okay, great.
Better right there.
Anyway, so for the purposes of performance measurement, you need your data frequent and granular because you need it to steer. So that's a very difficult problem given a bureaucracy associated with getting the data, the statistical information. Like I believe, and you would be an expert, that the LEHD data is actually quarterly and rather granular. So I would need to monitor, for instance, recovery from COVIDs, access to that to see how it's going in different parts of the country. I'd need it pretty quickly. Also from the evaluation standpoint, as the economy is moving and changing so rapidly right now, again, bureaucracy and lead time matters a lot. We're going to want to know which of the CARES interventions are working better and which are not working at all. So we don't pour money down a black hole. We get impact from it. So I'm interested in the lead time, the amount of bureaucracy involved with getting data from the three systems you discussed.
So that's a good point. Everyone's asking great questions here. So I think you're right that the challenge with the statistical agencies, I'm going to make lots of enemies now, so I've made lots already, but, has been their focus on the value proposition has been on accuracy, and God love them. They've done their best to create high quality information, but it can be weeks, months, quarters behind. And for many decision-making processes, and we've certainly seen it in COVID, you need close to real-time information. It's okay if it's not quite perfect, but you want to get information and put the thumb on the scales of timeliness rather than the thumb on the scales of quote-unquote accuracy. So, for example, Chris, the UI benefits data, it ain't perfect, but it can be turned around within 4 hours to get aggregate information down to the workforce boards at the local level so that it's actionable. So I think part of the challenge that we're going to have here and that the committee should be thinking about is think about a very broad measure of value in which the people who are at the coalface like you need to say, what's important? How can we best use data to make decisions, and when, right? So it's right on the money.
Great. I have a comment, and I think we have time for one more question. My comment would be that in defense of the statistical agencies, as the acting chief statistician, they're very much aware of the trade-off between the longer periodic and I'm just joking. It's a very good point, but the agencies are aware. I would invite you to look at the census pulse surveys, which were designed with help of many different agencies to try to get just that and try to get a perhaps dirtier, quicker, but still very useful picture of the evolution of many different markets. I think
exactly.
They partnered with a lot of different agencies, and honestly, one thing that was important there was to continually learn. So we not throw a survey together, but do your best to quickly design a survey, but also design a learning mechanism into it. And so as they've developed across the months, I think they've gotten better, and they also are very transparent about what they're measuring and what they're not, and the limitations of the data. So I think it's been a great success story. But anyway, we do have another question.
I think so as well, and I didn't mean to throw them under the bus. I was just pushing that the more that we have that focus on timeliness, obviously there's a trade-off, and just to be aware of those trade-offs. That's exactly right.
Yep, absolutely. And so Nick Hart had a question or comment as well.
So also can't say enough nice things about the pulse survey, and actually hope that we can do more of those as an innovation across the federal statistical system. But more to the presentation, Julia, thanks for the quick run through and examples. This is really super helpful. I guess this is a two-part question. Based on experience internationally, do you have any advice as we think about what it means to be a user of this restricted data? Like, are there clear lessons that we've observed from other countries about how they defined who the users and potential access points might be? So, like, does it just include academic researchers and government officials? Is it expansive to include industry researchers? And then the second piece, which is a little bit of a non sequitur, but I was wondering if you could say anything about international data sharing, since we're operating in a federal system here, and we'll hear about states in just a minute. Is there anything in the systems that you looked at that talk about cross-boundary data sharing?
That's great. So two answers. Largely it's academic researchers, government analysts. It's very hard to, in fact, I think in Stats NZ and in the UK, they asked, how do you feel about it? And the notion that data are going to be used for marketing purposes is kind of not on. So there'd be a lot of suspicion, I think, about the private sector coming in. question about cross-country data sharing. Yes, the Deutsche Bundesbank has taken the lead for financial data sharing, because what came up in the 2008 crisis was, first of all, that macro data were not adequate. The 2008-2009 financial crisis was you needed data on households, firms, banks, and stocks and shares. So equities. So you needed to build a micro data infrastructure. So you saw the G20 countries build research data centers in order to look at the effects of on the economic activity by modeling at the micro level. The challenge, of course, was that even though you had the Bank of France, the Deutsche Bundesbank, the Bank of Italy, and so on, each one of those had research data centers, they couldn't share across agency lines. And yet economic shocks don't end at country lines. So what they put together was something called Inexta, and I've got a slide deck on that if you're interested, because I've been involved in that. So the G20, but it's primarily the European countries have been, but also many in South America, have been working to share information about the metadata across country lines and on the work that the research has done. So the reason that the Deutsche Bundesbank has been so involved in the rich context work on data inventories that we've been doing is to automatically generate information for different topics, what data sets have been used to answer questions using AI and machine learning. And so that rather than having a manual process, build an automated process to do that, so that if I come in and I want to see what has someone in Portugal or Spain been doing on topic X, and what data have they been using and what metadata are available, you can pull that up automatically by automatically reading the publications and the working papers that those people have been doing. So building those machine learning algorithms to, in real time, capture all the work that's being done. And that's part of what that is. So you can look up Inexta to see what they've been doing.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions in the queue, and we are right at our first scheduled break time. So why don't I go ahead and call that, and we can reconvene at 10:10 to go into our next presentation, which is very much a companion to this one, and we'll talk about state-level issues, and we have several presenters. So thanks, everyone, for the wonderful discussion, and talk again very soon. All right, everyone, welcome back. We had a nice short break. We have another set of wonderful presentations to continue on this theme, and this will be talking about the state perspective. So I expect an equally great discussion and providing another aspect of how different geographic and functional and government areas consider their perspectives in this. As we've said it several times in these meetings, these first few meetings, this is just going to be an essential input into the success of this endeavor. So we're going to have a team of committee members, and let me introduce them. First up will be Kristen Loss, the Director of the Office of Evidence and Impact in Tennessee Department of Finance and Administration. We also have Anna Hugh, the Director of the Missouri Department of Labor and Industrial Relations, and Elizabeth Kovacs, Deputy Director of the Workforce Development at the South Carolina Department of Commerce, and Kim Berniaks, the Director of the Ohio Office of Budget and Management, also serving as the Chief Financial Officer. So I think this is a wonderfully diverse set of folks to hear about their differing challenges and opportunities and perspectives about working at the state level with data. Okay, so without further ado, why don't I turn it over to Kristen, who will kick us off.
Good morning, everyone. As Dawn mentioned, I'm Kristen Lotz. I'm the Director of the Office of Evidence and Impact for the state of Tennessee. I'm delighted to have with me presenting on state perspectives, as Dawn mentioned, Anna, Elizabeth, and Kim. If we'll go to the next slide, I'll talk about our agenda for our presentation. We decided to take a similar approach to each of our presentations. We're going to have the same basic structure for our slides. We will talk about how each of our states looks at evidence. We'll discuss how we are organized for evidence and data in our respective states. And then we'll talk about some specific considerations that may be unique to our individual states. The order that we will go in is in front of you here. We'll start with Missouri. Anna Huey will be presenting on behalf of Missouri. We'll have Elizabeth Kovacs present from South Carolina, myself talking about the experience of Tennessee. Kimberly Murnix will discuss Ohio and their perspective. And then finally, we'll come back together and talk about some overall state level challenges and issues that we have identified as a team. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Anna to talk about the Missouri experience.
Good morning, everyone. So hello from Missouri. Following the format that Kristen's outlined, here in Missouri, we look at evidence, and there are two primary examples I'll share with you. The first one is during the annual budget process. So our Office of Administration, which handles all of our administration functions for the state, their Office of Accounting, Budget and Accounting requires state agencies to provide both financial and programmatic performance metrics in each year's decisions. We do have new decision item process for any sort of new request for budget information. And in that new decision item, we do have to, provide some level of data to make the case for why those new budget items are required and what sort of outcomes that we will project utilizing some of that baseline data. For more information about that, folks can certainly take a look at our Budget Explorer that is online and take a look at the different agencies and again, how different programs utilize different data sets to build the case for why certain budget expenditures are required to either be maintained or new expenditures are needed as well. In addition, COVID has certainly demonstrated and made the case not only to ourselves as state agency, but also to the public for why data is really needed and required in terms of our day-to-day decision-making, both to support, again, our daily decisions related to how we respond to COVID, but also any sort of ongoing emergency declarations that are needed for the state as well. And so we've adopted a fusion cell team of teams approach to how we respond to COVID here in Missouri. And part of that is we have daily discussions, and it is very heavily data driven in terms of giving an assessment of what the current situation is to real decision-making points that we bring to that fusion cell group in terms of recommendations and what sort of data is used to kind of make those next points and how to move on with that. So that has definitely helped, again, to demonstrate across our state agencies the need and use of data, but also the great collaboration and the mindset of not need to know, but need to share, so that we create a better level of awareness across the entire state organization. Because of this, we've also created very recently the Show Me Strong Recovery interactive website. There's a lot of great data on there, particularly not just about public health, but also the economic impact that COVID has had on the state and also the social impact. So everything from the use of, food banks to higher fatalities and accidents on our roads. That information is all, again, showcased on our showmestrong.mo.gov website with the data tab. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we're organized in the state for evidence and data, we are highly decentralized in the sense that each agency has specific program requirements for data collection and reporting according to our state and federal statutes. And so that, you know, for many, many years, our focus has been very much on the compliance aspects of data collection and reporting, and not as much on the usage and data sharing across state agencies. However, we do have some good examples of where some of that has already occurred and we need to continue to build on. Our State Chief Information Officer, which again is housed in our Office of Administration, is really the chief executive to take a look at data and take a look not just from the IT perspective and security, but also usage. That role has certainly evolved over time, and we're looking towards, I guess, 2021, where we're hoping the state legislature will approve a position for a state data officer role under the state CIO. We think that will greatly enhance Missouri's ability to organize and structure how we're collecting data and how we're using that for evidence building. In addition, for many years, our Missouri Economic Research and Information Center, which is currently housed at the Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development, has served as the state's labor market information shop. And through their work, they have helped to form the Missouri Data Governance Committee, which was formed in 2011 utilizing the Workforce Data Initiative federal grant to really try to improve data collection and data sharing. You know, through that, we've had a number of good initiatives. Currently, we have 7 agencies that participate in a data sharing agreement with that governance committee, and that includes our Department of Economic Development, Department of Elementary Secondary Education, Department of Labor and Industrial Relations, Department of Higher Education Workforce Development, Department of Corrections, Department of Social Services, and just recently, last month, the Department of Mental Health also joined that group. And so, again, it is an opportunity, it's a framework for how agencies can better share data. We've had some successes and products that have been, and services that have been generated through this agreement with the Workforce Longitudinal Data System. And you know, again, we continue to work on some projects related to not just employment outcomes, but also in the corrections arena on release and recidivism prevention. Next slide. In terms of our state-specific considerations, you know, one of the big things, again, that we've realized in the last few years is while we do have some very talented pockets of individuals throughout the state workforce that are great data scientists and analysts, we really wanted to heighten the awareness of data and really taking a look at it as an asset to the state that really needs to be not just protected and utilized within the specific program in which it's collected, but how can we broaden the use in a safe, secure, and a responsible way. So a big effort has been made on the state, and Julia Lane has been very active with us a while. She's a Mizzou grad, so just in case you guys don't remember that, she does have connections back to Missouri. She's been working with us through her Coleridge initiative to help train state staff. And really, again, it is about raising awareness of state staff in terms of not just the data that they collect and work with day to day, but also, you know, these are programmatic staff that maybe don't do the heavy data work that oftentimes we have some specialists handle. So it's about creating that greater awareness overall. And so far, we've sent, I think, at least 50 students through this training program with the Coleridge Initiative called their Applied Data Analytics Program. And I know with some support from the U.S. Department of Labor and Employment Training Administration right now, we're about to send another group of 8 to go through. But that particular program now is focusing on unemployment to reemployment information, and that is training. I'm not sure in data, and Julia can probably chime in later, but how many other states will also be participating in that. So that's a real push on the state side in terms of, again, increasing our capability and awareness of utilizing data. And then another example of our work has also been Missouri partnering with fellow states, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky to form the Midwest Data Collaborative. We're currently working on some governance structure, but two particular projects that we're focusing on now are creating a portal related to unemployment to reemployment, which we feel will be vital in terms of all of our states' recovery from COVID, but also getting a better sense, and Kentucky is leading, Illinois is leading that particular effort, and Kentucky is leading another effort in terms of better understanding how our state's graduates are moving across the region as well after they graduate. So some of those graduation outcomes. And then the final example in terms of one of our partnerships with the University of Missouri system is we are working with the Missouri Science and Technology Policy Fellows program to bring in executive fellows. This program was started 2 years ago by the university to provide data scientists, so recent master's grads from data, to come into the legislature to help with providing notes, legislative notes with the data science slant to that. Now I am helping with recruitment of the first executive branch fellow, and we're hoping to bring that into the Division of Employment Security to help us address some unemployment data needs as well. So again, a lot of great activity happening on the state side, and certainly looking forward to hearing from my colleagues at the other states as well to hear what they're doing. Thank you.
Good morning. I am Elizabeth Kovacs with the South Carolina Department of Commerce, and I am the Deputy Director for Workforce Development. I think one of the things that we discuss from a state perspective is that we are all coming at this from a different approach, but a very similar approach. Because we come from a variety of agencies, we have a little different take on it, but there certainly are a lot of the same situations that we're delving into. So when we look at evidence, of course, from a transparency perspective, we're very sensitive to making sure that that data is available. Policy and budget decisions are of course made based on that data analysis. I would be remiss if I didn't say that data is still considered a scary term. So every time we use that term, we get a little pushback from that. From a Department of Commerce perspective, right? We're looking at this from as the state's business agency. We're looking at how we recruit industry and how we expand our current industries. And you know, Nick made a comment about earlier during Julia's about crossing boundaries. And when we look at economic development, they don't look at county lines and sometimes state lines if they're on bordering states. So we're very conscientious about that. We want to ensure that the companies that we're recruiting have, you know, the trained workforce from an education side to a technical side to meet those needs. And so when you look at bullet number 2, you know, individual agencies utilize various data systems to collect, disseminate, and analyze their own data. We're trying to herd those things together, if you will, to try to make really sound evidence-based decisions within South Carolina. So there is an opportunity for a better mechanism for data administration for workforce and education to better align our training and industry needs. I would be remiss if I didn't give a big shout out to the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness, Ken Poole. He may be on this call today. We started working with the CREC back in 2015 to really figure out how we as a state could put together a group of agencies and how we can share this data, but also make these decisions based on that. And so with the help of the CREC, we have been working towards this, if you will. And also in 2016, our legislative body created a coordinating council for workforce development. And really the impetus of that and the emphasis is how do we, let me look at my notes so I get this correctly, develop and implement procedures for sharing information and coordinating efforts among stakeholders to prepare the state's current and emerging workforce. So that council lives under our agency, and we manage and staff that council. So it's part of why I was interested in joining this group, so that we could see how we push the needle. So next slide, please. As we talk about how we are organized in our state for evidence and data, I would say we are a hybrid model. Like Anna said, according to state and federal statutes, all of the different agencies have to maintain their data based on those statutes. However, with the caveat, I think Amy is very familiar with this. We actually, in our state, we actually capture the healthcare data of all of our citizens, right? So this is a busy slide, and I'll be happy to share this with you. However, we're already capturing this, so we are trying to model our current. I like the infrastructure word, Julia. So I'm going to start using that. Is how do we capture information about citizens on a holistic viewpoint, kind of like New Zealand did, and we are already capturing this with healthcare data through our Office in Fiscal Affairs, which is also the agency that does our economic forecasts. So similar to the BEA from a state standpoint. So this is already in place, and we just can't figure out how to really push the needle to expand this into other types of data integration. So next slide, please. When we talk about, our state-specific considerations, it is governance policy. How do we advance data governance among our stakeholders? Understanding actual versus the perceived restrictions in sharing data, our data sharing process management, identifying and prioritizing our initiatives. We've alluded to this during Julia's presentation, but it's the scarcity, right? It's the IT piece. It's the CIO piece. Of course, we're very sensitive in South Carolina. We had a data breach in 2015, so we're very sensitive to the citizens of South Carolina, and certainly the outcomes and the metrics associated with that. So looking forward to continuing to learn about other states and how we can not recreate the wheel, but how we can utilize those best practices to implement in South Carolina. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Kristen.
Thanks, Elizabeth. If we can actually back up to the previous slide. Thank you. So I, again, am Kristen Lotz. I'm the director of the Office of Evidence and Impact for the state of Tennessee. We're housed under our Department of Finance and Administration. Tennessee is somewhat unique in that we do have an office now dedicated to evidence and data analytics. And our office was created just a little over a year ago, so we're still really fairly new. But the main mission of our office is to ensure that evidence and data are a part of both our budgeting and policy making procedures in the state of Tennessee to ensure better outcomes for our citizens. We do this in a few different ways. We, first of all, are involved in inventorying the base budget. We engage with each of our state executive branch agencies to determine what programs they have as a part of their base budget, the funding level for each, and we also utilize an evidence framework that we have established to determine the level of evidence for each of these programs. Evidence is included in all cost increase and also reduction plans that are submitted by each of our departments as a part of their annual budgeting process. Initially, in the first year of our office, we had created a form simply for cost increase requests. However, in light of the pandemic and the need to make cuts to the budget, we realized very quickly and had to pivot very quickly in creating a form also for budget reductions. And so we were able to do that to help our decision makers, the folks in our governor's office, as they were making some really difficult decisions around reductions that were going to have to be made to the state's budget. The forms that we provide to the departments to fill out, again, for both cost increase requests and reductions, are a tool that they can use to help explain the level and type of evidence that are tied to each. We then evaluate the forms that they submit. We compile the results that we received from each of the forms, and then that information is shared again with our decision makers, and so they have the information related to the evidence behind the programs when they're making these difficult budgeting decisions. We're also working very closely with our Office of Strategic Technology Solutions in Tennessee to streamline data management to improve the usage of our data in Tennessee state government. We are improving the ability for agency data sets to speak to one another in order to answer meaningful questions about program impact. And so we have embarked upon already a couple of enterprise data analytics projects. That's the Office of Evidence and Impact, in coordination with our Strategic Technology Solutions, the IT division of state government, to analyze data from multiple agencies in more of an enterprise fashion so that we can gain some valuable policy insights. Most recently, we have a project actually that is just wrapping up now that we were able to utilize some CARES funding for, related to the impact of COVID on the state of Tennessee and our services that we provide. So we have been able to link up data sets, multiple data sets from multiple executive branch agencies in Tennessee to learn the true impact of the pandemic on our programs and services. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we're organized, again, we are a bit unique in that we do have an office that focuses on evidence in Tennessee. So at this point, we do have a centralized approach to evidence and evaluation, that being with our office, again, the Office of Evidence and Impact. When it comes to data, however, we are still largely decentralized. We primarily collect and analyze our data at the agency level currently. There are some exceptions to this. As I mentioned, we have started doing some enterprise data projects. We also have a website called Transparent Tennessee that you can go to and view dashboards from all of our executive branch agencies. It's openmaps.tn.gov that I have listed there if you're interested in taking a look at those. But as we're moving more and more toward a more centralized approach to data, we believe we're going to be able to really make a lot of gains in the ways that we make policy and budgeting decisions in the state once we're able to more efficiently link up data from our various departments. And so we're embarking on those efforts currently. And if we'll go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So as I've mentioned or alluded to, we are focused on greater data sharing between our executive branch departments. We're doing that in a few different ways. I mentioned the enterprise data analytics projects that we have spearheaded with our Office of Strategic Technology Solutions. We are also currently engaging in meetings with each of our executive branch agencies, their commissioners and senior staff, along with representatives from our governor's office, to lay the groundwork and spread the vision for increased data sharing in our state. We are talking with them about the barriers that exist currently to data sharing, which we'll all talk about together at the end of this presentation. But a lot of the barriers that we have seen, even in interdepartmental sharing in state government, has a lot to do with federal regulations, federal law around data privacy, what can be shared, what cannot be shared. With that said, however, maintaining the security of our data and the privacy of our citizens' data, our Tennessee businesses' data is paramount, and that is something that we are laser focused on in the state. As we are meeting with departments, we're asking them to do some things for us. We're starting out with creating an inventory of our state's data. We believe that that is phase one for us in Tennessee. What's interesting is that asking a department what data they have is sometimes a difficult question to answer. And so we are working with them very closely to develop an inventory of their data sets and the associated privacy level for each of those so that we have a better understanding of what data we actually have as a state amongst our state departments. Once we have that inventory work complete, we have now a tool, a data lake environment that has been acquired through our Office of Strategic Technology Solutions that will serve as the platform for this data sharing work that we're embarking upon. Once we have our data inventory, we are going to be working closely with our state departments, with our state leadership to determine some strategic policy questions to answer using the data that we have available to us. And so we are taking a very phased approach, but we want to be very deliberate and very cautious as we move forward with this effort in Tennessee. As I mentioned, we are really focused on data analytics at the enterprise level, treating our state's data as the strategic asset that it really is, and looking to overcome the barriers that have been issues in the past related to sharing data between departments. But we're really excited about the future of data sharing and enterprise data analytics in Tennessee, and the incredible insights that we know we're going to gain from our data once we put it to better use for us. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Kim.
Good morning, Kim Ernix. I'm the Director of the Ohio Office of Budget and Management. And of course, as kind of been alluded to, and I think each of the discussions among the states this morning, data and budget go hand in hand. I think that the budget office often becomes the place where a lot of the evidence and data work begins because the staff in our offices are very used to working with data and numbers. So how we look at evidence in Ohio, we review data as part of our state budgeting and planning process. We have statutory authority in the OBM, the Office of Budget and Management statute, that we can require agencies to submit program data and performance information as part of the budgeting process. So we do that, and that has been part of our budgeting process for many years. Agencies submit notable statistics on each of their programs, and that is just kind of ingrained and embedded in our budgeting process, again, for quite a long time. Individual agencies also conduct their own program-specific performance reviews and evaluations. So while we do have some integration as part of the budgeting process and part of our current data efforts that I'll talk about in a moment, not each, but many of our agencies have their own evaluation centers within their agencies. So one thing that we're working towards is bringing more of that together instead of or kind of to enhance the current model that's very decentralized. we did recently unveil a new website that we're very excited about, data.ohio.gov, and that is a new portal that brings together data and research and reports that so we can have more meaningful insight to our data and really share it publicly. So this is a public facing site. It provides links to many of the other data analytics projects that are already on various agency websites. It's kind of that one-stop shop portal. So we'll go to the next slide. So how we're organized. I mentioned the budget office, but I also want to talk about Innovate Ohio. This is a new office. It's less than 2 years old, and it was established in law within our governor's office, and it's led by our Lieutenant Governor, John Husted. And the objective of Innovate Ohio is to bring data together to inform policy and decision-making so that we can constantly move Ohio and innovate. And we've had a lot of success bringing together a platform. We have a data lake, the Innovate Ohio platform, and early in the DeWine Husted administration, Governor DeWine signed an executive order requiring agencies to move their data to that platform. So that process has been, it's in process. It's largely complete for some of our larger data sets, and our agencies are all moving towards that. So that has been a huge success, but we're still working towards it. We have several dashboards, public-facing dashboards, including the Ohio Checkbook Interactive Budget site that provides the very detailed look into all of our state spending, and it also includes local spending. So local governments can submit their data to the Ohio Checkbook, and so that their citizens can have transparency and see how their budgeting resources are being spent. We also, this has been talked about in a couple of other states too, our COVID dashboard. You know, COVID absolutely shined a light on the need to have continuous updated data, and that really has provided an opportunity for us to make the case for why it's important to share data, to have ways that we can kind of continuously provide that visibility into our data. We also have an unemployment claims dashboard that was in development prior to COVID, but that has also, again, the current crisis really shines a light on why data is important and enables us to make that ongoing case. And this is all accessible through the data.ohio.gov dashboard. Go to the next slide. So some of the state-specific considerations, IT optimization and centralization. This has been an ongoing effort for over a decade. You know, if you rewind, 10 or 12 years, the situation in Ohio was each state agency had their own data systems, their own separate servers, their own, separate locations. And we have really made a very concerted effort, again, over multiple years to centralize those systems and bring them together so that we can, share and optimize. And, that was quite an effort, just the technological aspects of that and getting the buy-in for that on the front end and an ongoing basis has been a challenge, but we're kind of through that point. IT innovation, obviously, staying up to date with all the latest IT and analytics opportunities is important. The digital experience for our citizens is something that we are very focused on. So our Innovate Ohio office isn't just focused on bringing together data for kind of data purposes. It's really so we can share information and make the interaction with government better for our citizens so we can better serve Ohio. And then data analytics tools, training, that is, one of the challenges I think for any organization is staying up to date on all of the tools and opportunities and constantly training as better and new opportunities come around. And shared services and collaboration. So it is easy for us to operate kind of very decentralized in different agencies in their own silos, but how can we share information, bring things together so that we can leverage and focus on Ohioans? So that is an ongoing challenge, and having the focus both at the budget level and at the governor's office through Innovate Ohio really provides the leadership that I think is necessary for any projects like to be successful, for collaboration to be successful. I think the leadership and the focus from the top is critically important. So we can go to the next slide. So I will kind of close out.
Check. We do want to leave a little time for questions. So.
Yep, I will go through the state level challenges very quickly. We found that as we were discussing our state situations individually, there is a lot of challenge that is quite common. So we group these into 3 different buckets, and I am not going to read all of these for the sake of time and discussion, but kind of a lack of incentives, lack of federal interagency data sharing, a lack of a standardized reporting framework, and then just legacy systems that make that don't provide incentives to actually move to sharing data. The culture around the governance of data, always an ongoing challenge. Government programs are often quite linear, and so bringing things together and kind of changing that kind of ingrained culture can be very, very challenging. And just the culture around data is often focused on compliance. And so kind of changing the mindset and the culture from we're just complying over here and kind of checking the boxes to we really want to know what's going on to impact results for our citizens. And that brings us to the social impact. If we want to improve the results for our citizens, but there's also kind of a distrust of government data sharing, that fear of Big Brother, and just ongoing privacy concerns. So the challenges presented from the broader just societal outlook on data sharing, I think are something that we constantly need to keep in mind and ensure that we are doing everything we can to protect our citizens' privacy. So with that, I will turn it over to questions and discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I actually think that would be a great slide to keep up to facilitate the discussion. I don't know if you can go back to it, but that just is a good summary of what you all just talked about. So since we do have a public question, I'll start with that. How are the states thinking about ways to use more evidence in addition to data in their budget processes? So how does it feed all the way back into who gets the money?
I can take that as the state budget director. That's what we look at. Budgets are a process of elevating the things that are most important. And if you look at how you're spending your dollars, you know what your priorities are. And we want to prioritize those things that have evidence behind them so that we can get results. It can be challenging because there are established programs that, we're always competing for those finite resources. But the more we can use evidence to tell the story of the why behind a budget item, the more successful we can be when we are making the case in the legislative process, for example. So the more data and information we have, but we have to be able to use the data to tell the story of the impact. So that's kind of the key that I see in the overall budgeting process.
I think something too that we are often lacking when we have a compliance focus on our reporting and data gathering that then feeds into the budget process is that those reports don't necessarily translate back to the very individual level of our impact. And so that has required, I think, a lot of state agencies to rethink how can we take the data that we're already gathering it and translating to that individual impact in our budget presentations, as Kimberly is saying, is telling that story. But again, it is forcing us to really kind of rethink the methods and the process of how that data is gathered, and can we get better usage out of the information that we are actually collecting, not just for compliance purposes.
Great. I had a question, which was I saw a lot of thoughtful work has gone into how to present the data with all your dashboards. I think a lot of folks are interested in the links, and they all look very impressive. Are there any of your dashboards that actually incorporate non-state, say federal or other state data in kind of your official way, or is it mostly focused? Have you gone all the way to a study that incorporates kind of data that's outside of your control into a dashboard?
I am not certain that we are doing that, although I think our unemployment dashboard does that. We do have views. So the answer is yes, because I know that on that dashboard there's mapping features where you can look at the country as a whole and drill into Ohio. So absolutely. And as I mentioned, our open checkbook, while it's not required that a local government submit their financials to that, thousands of our local governments, cities, townships, counties are doing that. So we have both, sharing up and sharing to the local government level as well.
Okay, great. I have Chris Heflin has a question, and then Barry Johnson.
Hi, thank you, ladies. Very, very useful, and you confirmed something that I've long suspected. The states have a lot to teach us at the federal level. Here's a question for you. I've been working with our chief data officer on creating an inventory of our data sets that follows the rules for the federal inventory we're trying to create on a new improved level. And I hear a lot of discussion right within Commerce of how we need to conform to a common schema to make the data interoperable and searchable. Is there room for some kind of a recommended schema approach, data structure that could be put out as an option to state and local governments? So at the end of all these efforts, we have pieces that fit together nicely and combined well.
So this is Kristen. So Christine, your point is a really good one. And yes, I think having a common schema for your data is something that is very important. And it's something that we aspire to in Tennessee. But I would say at this phase of our work, we are quite a ways away from developing what that looks like. So this is not an answer that is helpful, but in truth, we have not developed what that looks like quite yet. I don't know if others have.
Well, one of the things that we put on our challenges was the lack of standardized framework and data definitions. So absolutely, that is an area that I think additional focus and hopefully this committee could be helpful in that and providing incentives kind of across federal programs that build towards a standardized reporting and data sharing framework, I think would be really helpful.
Sure, it'd be a shame to have 50 different efforts coming up with a schema that works as opposed to one combined effort that at least puts a North Star out there for all of us.
And Christine, I think we take it a step further is we'd like to see that at the federal level as well, right? Is how can that standardization and framework be built at the federal level so that states can, excuse me, the states can show that the feds are doing it and it makes it more palatable at the state level and probably at the local level when we hear from
You got my vote. Sounds right. Thank you.
I think that also references back to last meeting's reference from Barry as well in terms of, we had discussion about can we take some common reporting that these, maybe some key programs do and take a look across what are those reporting requirements, because again, having that common schema would lower the challenges from the state level to actually do the actual collection as well. And I think it would facilitate the back and forth of the data sharing from federal and state level too.
Okay, great. And that sounds like a vote for what this data service could focus on in this committee. So Barry, to you.
You sort of answered, started to address the question I was going to ask, and that's just as you were putting together this presentation, and thanks very much for it, it was really great. Were there specific asks that we should be debating here in this committee for improving the efforts that you have that are ongoing? I hear you talking, the discussion about data formats was I think one area, and we are working on that at the federal level as well, but are there other things that kind of emerge from these talks that we should be considering as we work on our toward a report?
We did talk about the various federal privacy laws that can inhibit our ability to share data amongst our own state agencies, that also, at the federal level. So I think that's something that would be really beneficial for us and really the nation as a whole, is if there were more common privacy and security laws, as opposed to so many very specific that aren't always integrated, right? So I think that would be an overall goal. I know that it would be, maybe it's an impossible goal, but anything that can move us in that direction or allow, with of course privacy caveats, more of that sharing across the different policy areas would be very helpful.
And if I could just echo that from Tennessee as well, I mean, that's been identified as our biggest barrier to sharing data between our departments within state government, not thinking about externally, but how can we share amongst ourselves as state government, and the federal restrictions on doing so are quite challenging. And so I just want to also put in a plug and echo what Kim has said.
Well, us feds are always present challenges, don't we? No, absolutely. This is absolutely a big part of the conversation. Julia had a comment, and then Amy, and then we're getting close to our next scheduled break. So let's see where we are with that.
So what a fantastic set of presentations. So thank you. There was a lot of thoughtfulness that went into those. And this is the money shot, right? This last set of recommendations. I really want to echo the role of the feds in this notion of a standardized reporting framework, like in education data, workforce data, everything that you can think of. The role of the federal agencies and the incentives associated with federal reporting, as much as it's a challenge, getting that standardized data structure really, I think, is an important area that maybe this committee could consider. So I just wanted to echo what's on these slides.
Okay, great. And Amy?
Hi, I just wanted, in my experience talking to folks from Department of Human Services or state departments of education or even school districts, the budget driver conversation that we just had doesn't often resonate with them, because there's reasonable skittishness that they have whenever they're protecting the records of folks who are vulnerable, or students, or even health information exchanges. I had a question for our fantastic presenters. How often are you getting feedback from the reps from these other departments on what their concerns are, or their perceived or actual limitations in sharing data, and the awareness and the acceptance of it for their clients?
Amy, I'll jump in on that. And, we made a concerted effort to bring all of our partners, and Dom, I know we're right on time, so I'll have to make this quick, but we really wanted to get their feedback, and that is how our draft workforce and education legislation was drafted based on their comments. Again, I referenced working with the CREC, and they really showed how you can access that data and within all of the HIPAA, FERPA regulations. So it goes back to some of my colleagues from the other states is what's that story behind it? What's the storytelling? When we look at labor market data, we know that that's based on historical information. So we like to tell the story of, we know that we're going to need 5,000 of these types of jobs within this area of the state because of who we're recruiting, and otherwise we wouldn't know that. So the funding then needs to go to let's make sure we have the education and training in that part of the state, which may look different. So that's my short answer that turned long.
Okay, great. We are right on time. I will. There are a couple of comments that we are lucky that we're actually not cutting off this conversation. I do think that this will be data standards will be very much a subject of further presentations and in additional meetings, especially when we talk about the federal system a little bit more. And so much more opportunity to talk about this. And also there are standards efforts across the government that are ongoing. We have one link that will be shared that will show up in the curated list for the public as well. And there's plenty of other links there for people that are interested in following up on this. So thank you very much. This is a wonderful set of presentations. I was especially struck by just really the thought and the effort, and even like a couple of the statutory frameworks that have been built around this. So we're clearly starting from a very developed base, this discussion, and so that really it's heartening to see the quality of the type of information, the presentation that we've seen across the state. So why don't we go into our second break? Why don't we reconvene at 11:15 this time? And we're going to hear about the local perspective. So we're going on a long journey today. So thanks, everyone. This has been an especially great conversation today. And talk soon. Thanks, everyone, and welcome back. So heard a wonderful presentation from the state. So now we know the bar is high, and I'm sure our next presenters will meet that. So again, thank you, Anna Elizabeth, Kristen, and Kim. Great discussion, and it gave us a lot to think about what we should think about as a federal committee in this area. So our next discussion will provide further appreciation for the perhaps widely varied needs of different constituencies. We're going to hear from the local perspective. We scheduled to speak are David Park, the program director for the Center for Municipal Data and Analytics at the National League of Cities. And we originally also had Layla Alcaresh, the Chief Innovation Officer for the City of Dallas, Texas. She was called away for a emergency meeting, but I wanted to announce her anyway in the chance that she may be able to rejoin us. So they are going to provide their thoughts about how local governments, metropolitan governments see the world. I get a sense of the wide variation. I think we're going to hear even more about the wide variation, roles, governance structures, capabilities, and engagement with the public. And then as always, after that team's presentation, we'll take questions and discuss. And so I will turn it over to David. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Good morning, everyone. As Tom said, I'm David Park. I'm hoping Lila is able to join us, but I'll do my best here. Next slide. Keep this conversation going. So we framed this as a discussion around things we wanted the federal government to know as it related to the evidence-based policymaking, but also, what is it like where the rubber meets the road? Next slide, please. So we talked about definitions and standards earlier. Data is one piece, but actual definitions of governments is another. Particularly in my line of work, talking to whether it's a private company or different federal agencies, there's always a bit of confusion on what counts as a local government. So I went to the arbiter, our U.S. Census Bureau, and they have 4 or 5, depending on how you take their definitions of local government. For the purpose of this discussion, I'll keep it to 4 to not make it too confusing. Counties, so those are the subdivisions, right? We have the 50 states plus the District of Columbia, a little over 3,000 counties. You might have heard a lot about, the CARES Act funds being dispersed to large government entities. County was one of them if they met the $500,000 or larger threshold. Municipalities is another. So that's the category I work in. So that's a little over 19,000. So in that little map, that screenshot, that's the boundary of Dallas, Texas, which sits in the county of Dallas. Below that, we have what are called townships. So you take something like that map of Dallas, you have smaller subdivisions. In essence, they're smaller areas, right, based on historic settlement patterns, history, that have kind of been built out to become townships. And then finally, we have school districts, which in many communities overlays with a township, municipality, or county. So if we're talking about, data standards, definitions, interoperability, these are the types of entities we also want to think about. Next slide. So on municipalities, I wanted to give everyone a sense of the, what do municipalities actually do? They are primarily service providers, delivers of service. In terms of population, we're looking at the Now Village in Nebraska, which is about, I think it's 100 acres. It's literally one farm. If anybody's interested in learning the story about that, feel free to reach out to me later. To New York City, 8.4 million. And how many people live in municipalities? So again, think about that map I showed you earlier, the screenshot boundaries, 210 million. So that's as of 2018. 2020 will probably, show us an uptick. That's what we're projecting. So close to 2/3 of the U.S. population. And where does everyone else live? Mostly in unincorporated counties. So I think a good example is in the D.C. area. For those of you who are familiar with Montgomery County, Maryland, there are 2 towns or cities located within the county of Montgomery County, Rockville, Gaithersburg, and actually Tacoma Park, but everyone else lives in the unincorporated part. So they're still living somewhere, but it's just not a municipality. And of the 19,000 plus municipalities, what's the average population size? So a little over 10,000. If you take the median, actually it's even less. It's somewhere around 5,000 or 6,000. So that means there's a lot of towns which have small populations. And I'll go over in a sec some examples. And then who works for municipalities? So if we're looking at that average town of, say, a little over 10,000, there are about 120 full-time employees. I won't go through this full pie, but there are 12 main categories that, where they provide services, whether, we're conscious, aware of it or not. Public safety is one, so fire, police, EMT, education. So this could be an overlay with the school district, but this also includes central offices, liaison offices, state liaison offices, particularly for counties, utilities. So many small communities actually run their own power, water, sewer. So they have that as an operational business. Transportation, so your standard DOT, highways, roads, bridges, and then, larger communities, transit, administration, health and social services, which is something we've been focusing in on and sharing best practices during the pandemic, Parks and Rec, and I won't go through the rest. You can check it out. Next slide. So what I wanted to show you guys is the lay of the land. So what's the universe of municipalities? And to an extent, you could probably scale this to counties as well, but I don't want to make overgeneralize the similarities. But in terms of the people, the challenges they face, and then the buckets, I'll call them, of population aggregates, right? So we have 5 categories here. I'm not going to read through all of these, but I have examples of the types of towns many of you are probably familiar with, and then also the challenges. So I want to hone in on that middle tier of 40 to 20,000. So there's, a lot of communities smaller and less number that are larger. But this is kind of where you see, if you're scanning like the web, or for me, it's talking to a lot of these, mayors, city council members, city managers. what do they do online, right? So that's like a leading indicator, right? Do they have a website, right? So if you go below, this threshold, they don't have online services, they don't have the ability to manage online transactions. And then you go above, that's where you see the open data portals. These are typically the communities that have much more mature, I'll call them, data capacity. So whether that's engaging with their local county, the state, or the federal government. I threw in the last one of 65,000, the American Community Survey. Understandably, that's a constraint given just how big that survey is or how not big it is. That's a common complaint, and we have to explain to them that's because of the size of that survey, but 65,000. But incidentally, that's also a threshold for when you see, again, economies of scale, so they're able to have a big enough staff, IT budget to build out that infrastructure. Next slide. So this is Lila's section. I'm going to do my best here. What we wanted to do is paint a broad strokes picture of, of flow of funds, right? And then the challenges along the way. We didn't want to kind of hone in too much on a couple case studies. Lila is in the city of Dallas. I live in Washington, D.C. We didn't want to give you just like those two examples, for instance, or other places we've worked, but talk about, for instance, with the CARES Act or other federal funds that flow down, where do they go and how do they go? So, you see the chart. A lot of programs go directly from the federal government to states, but you have a number of programs and initiatives that will push money directly from the federal government to the locality. So I'll go back to what I was talking about earlier with the CARES Act. I mentioned counties, but cities were also involved with that. So there was this $500,000 threshold where localities received direct funds from Treasury. So they had the CRF, the Corona Relief Funds, and the rest was dispersed via the states at their discretion. So they established formulas, reimbursement, all that stuff. So you can see the flow of funds there from state to county and then to city. And just so people are wondering, there are a number of cities that are also counties, Baltimore, San Francisco, Philadelphia. So one and the same. So there's a good bit of overlap. And then you just have, two examples on the regional governments too. So Council of Governments, what people commonly refer to as COGS, and I'm guessing many of you are. Metropolitan planning organizations, USDOT uses that to disperse funds. And again, many in this audience probably know the formulas far better than I do. Next slide, please. So as we think about the COVID crisis, we've been trying to be, this is me talking about National League of Cities, connecting a lot of the communities we work with resources, right? So whether it's connecting them to the right person at CDC, HHS, or connecting them to another city with similar size or similar issues, right? That's what we've been trying to connect the dots on. I think a good example is COVID reporting by race. For instance, so many of you probably followed over the summer. The CDC issued guidance in June on, requiring localities to report cases and deaths by race, right? So this takes us back to standards and definitions matter, right? So, some communities came to us and they wanted to know the difference and understand the distinction between race and ethnicity, right? So if we're reporting simply by white, right, and not including a designation of non-Hispanic, why would that be exclusionary, inclusionary, et cetera? And we had to point them to the CDC guidance, but also to the census definitions. Many of them were familiar with the questions that appear in the census. And Lila's back. I'll just wrap up my last thought and hope she can jump in here. But for instance, with the reporting, that started at a city or county level. So most public health departments exist at the county level. So if it's coterminous with the city, then it's not as difficult. If not, it'll go from the city to the county. So reporting and then back up to the state and then to the federal government, or in some cases directly to the federal government. Just at a high level, want to emphasize the importance of, again, definitions and standards. It may seem trivial, but again, these questions come up, and then also interoperability, right? So if we're talking about states having systems that have interoperability with the federal government, But I think, as we heard earlier about being able to share information across states, interoperability of states is incredibly crucial, right? So I live in DC. We have DC, Maryland, and Virginia. There's a contact tracing app, this COVID app, right? Initially, DC's worked only with North Carolina, but that's largely because of the provider, right? Standards matter. Later on, they realized they probably needed to coordinate with Maryland and Virginia. Again, it's like they have these vendor contracts and they have to follow the procurement rather than, adhering to what might make the most sense in terms of boundaries, right? Whether we're talking about public health or economic. Lila, I want to give you a window here if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, David. Appreciate you taking on some of this extra work. So yeah, I think David made some really great points and had a perfect segue here. So, what we meant to translate here for crisis reporting or COVID or in a real life situation is the importance of thinking about standardization yet flexibility. So traditionally, if you think about data infrastructure in a post-programmatic world, you would complete a program, you have associated data collection. And with crisis reporting, there are multiple levels of government that are essentially building the plane and flying it at the same time. So we have some existing infrastructure that was in place prior to COVID, and we also have new ones that were attempted to brought online just to ensure that we have the proper reporting structures in a real-time basis. So one of the instances or examples I wanted to share here was, in the beginning we had federal resources, state and local, who were all trying to do testing. So from that perspective, we did have a common form about what we were collecting and how we were collecting it, but it was easy to compare across because of that standardization. But for comparative purposes, we also want to offer some local flexibility. So for instance, one of the things that we wanted to look at was, could additional questions be added given the domino impact of the crisis? Do you need a food assistance? Do you need clothing? Traditionally, those are not questions you would ask when people are coming in to take a test, but there are additional things that could help local cities respond to a crisis in real time. And it's also just more efficient to collect this type of information in a singular interaction versus having to go back and have resources dedicated to follow-up situations. So if we could then see anonymized geographic distribution of where people are being tested and identify those associated social needs to really measure the impact of the crisis in communities, that would be something that's beneficial that we could think about for future iterations of crisis and in situations where we're not just looking at programs that have been executed, but programs that are happening in real time. And so I think the state presentation hinted on this, but data lag is really important as well. So if we're going through a reporting through a hierarchical chain, it can be really difficult to analyze that data in real time. So today we know how many tests happened, but really what we're trying to do is build the infrastructure towards taking that data and moving towards uncovering trends and insights at a much faster pace than traditionally cities do. So that's one of the things that I wanted to emphasize on this slide was just the reporting structure, hierarchical, the standardization that's necessary, but also flexibility as well. And as we think about building our data infrastructure at a national level, not only thinking about the normal programmatic elements, but also in situations that come up in real time, is there going to be flexibility that will allow cities and federal governments, various levels of different institutions to be able to input and push data out in an electronic fashion versus paper forms, which we were using at some point, to also downloading data and allowing different jurisdictions to be able to see data in real time. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that we face at the local level, certainly not small, but reporting requirements is certainly one of them. Larger cities may have more flexibility to hire dedicated staff for program management roles to manage tasks, but this could be quite challenging for smaller cities. This also applies for grants management, block grants, the work of just compiling and submitting applications before the work has even begun. And then in terms of the reporting, staff ends up spending more of their time in compliance, which I know we spoke about at the state presentation, not necessarily on program evaluation because of capacity limits. And so the reporting requirements, to the extent that it's possible to streamline them or create, electronic funnels, would be really helpful. And then thinking about how much current reporting can be automated. So can data be uploaded directly to a singular system? And perhaps there is a system administrator that is in place before it becomes public. I think we saw this in one of the international examples before of having data being inputted, having a third party there, and then it, being pushed out and available for the public depending on your access level. And so if the goal is to really encourage evidence-based decision-making, how can the committee make recommendations to support cities of all sizes? And so a lot of that data that's collected at the federal level is actually being generated by cities of all sizes. And as David mentioned earlier, the majority of those cities actually have less than 1,000 people. The second challenge is looking at comparison data. A lot of cities have a peer group or a set of surrounding cities or suburbs that they like to analyze just for different challenges that span over the boundaries, mobility being one of them, crime could be another. And so many cities want to use data for program assessments, for instance, for community indicators, but if you're looking to conduct cross-analytics that require data from multiple agencies, sometimes it becomes difficult to merge data sets with different reporting requirements. So if there was a common field that can be used as a join across data sets, that would really minimize the heavy manual lift at the local level, because I think a lot of that lack of input and opportunity to really leverage the federal data set comes from the difficulty of looking at data sets across different agencies. And again, I hinted at this at the previous slide, but there's often a very large data lag. I think Dom even mentioned this at one point in some of the pulse studies that have been put into place to address this, but it does make it really difficult to conduct comparisons for real-time program improvements. So you might be comparing demographic data from a few years ago with current program performance, and sometimes the model isn't always accurate. And so one of the things I heard in preparing for this presentation and talking to some of my colleagues in other cities was, can common standards be established? I heard a lot about the need for federal leadership here. So for example, GTFS for transit is one. And if we had an example or a standard that existed, then cities could choose to build their own systems to those standards, and you could leverage and build efficiencies in multiple levels of government. The third challenge that we have is the ease of locating information. So if you're very familiar with federal sites, then it becomes innate to you. You kind of understand how the different city sites, or the federal sites work. But it can be difficult to locate the right data sets or where to go on a site because it's not consistent. Sometimes the search engines work differently with different agencies, the extent of what you can find in different agencies, and the level of depth of the data is actually different as well. And so if we're looking at the lowest level of data, sometimes it's hard to disaggregate, because the more specific we can get into what is happening on the ground at the lowest level, then we can use that information to, again, drive more improvements around data. So there are scenarios where data rollouts are deliberately done and rolled up, but it could be helpful, for instance, equity efforts to see the impact of one program in one zip code or community versus another. And finally, the issue of employee data skills and expertise. So the federal government, I think, has made tremendous progress here. They're really a model. I mean, I can just only imagine in commerce how many PhDs or quantitative-based roles exist. I think cities are still catching up. And the challenge remains that municipalities are very much still on a data journey. And I think in most instances, we don't even have people who are in dedicated so-called data analyst roles. And so if we can make the system easier to encourage a greater usage and simplify the use of it or the interface of it, I think that will be more helpful to create that buy-in and trust from cities of all sizes who may not have, again, the capacity or the funding to invest in the data in a way that the federal government is able to do, or even states are able to do. And there are whole, industries now and firms that really profit from the lack of data skills and capacity that will go on these federal sites, and they will create city-specific polygons and then sell that service to a city. And we have think tanks, various centers that will clean up data from federal sites to make it easier for cities and researchers. Opportunity Insights is a great example here of that. And it'd be great if we would be able to simplify the data from the system directly, so that way we wouldn't need to necessarily rely on those intermediaries, who are wonderful and definitely add value to the data that they're pulling from the federal sites, but sometimes might not be specific for every single city. We know that data talent isn't necessarily cheap, and people believe they can perhaps interchange a program manager or an assistant for data work. I've seen that in every city that I've worked in to date, but these investments can be really expensive for cities, and sometimes the language and the understanding around what data is meant to do and how to support evidence-based decision-making becomes really difficult if we're not speaking the same language and vernacular. And one of the feedbacks that I was given from a couple of my colleagues were, even if you were to build out a data infrastructure, something that becomes intuitive and simple to a database person is not going to be felt the same way by others who might go in to the system as well. So adding on potentially like training videos on the systems, walking through some data sets could be another step in the right direction to encourage adoption. And so I want to hit on some points from a previous slide about the types of data that we had. So I'll just go back shortly, and this isn't on the slide, but I did want to mention a couple of key points, and I'm sure David perhaps hinted on this as well. But, I think generally, again, in speaking with many of my old colleagues in various cities, to hear their thoughts on how to better connect cities and the federal government and how we can work as partners to really advance evidence-based decision-making. I think all of us on this committee understands the importance of managing data as a strategic asset. But over the past decade or so, cities are still starting to catch up and think about how the data points on their own is not what's transformative, but it's the analytics of the data points that really string together that could drive incremental and transformational changes to everyday programs. So we hinted at grant data and block grants as well, which mostly originate at the federal level, whether it's public safety grants, USDA, EPA, so on. Depending on how those data and grants are awarded, data is being sent upstream and downstream in multiple ways. So, if you're doing it upstream, it's what cities are providing, what the format is, and the downstream impact is how that data is actually being utilized after that award has been granted. So thinking about the different purposes of how we collect data and how the data can be leveraged for future use cases is also important. The other thing that I wanted to point out about grant data is, just using an example of, let's say, public safety innovation grant, and it's awarded to 10 cities. So at the end of the day, maybe the grantees are posted on the website with a synopsis. If I work for City A, I might read a description of City B that was also awarded. It's of a similar size. It's running a great project. I might be curious about the outcome, so I can replicate something similar here. And so if we're having discussions on a one-stop shop system, it's important to consider outcome data, not just individual data sets as well. So if there's an opportunity to contextualize that quantitative data, that would be really helpful in terms of developing and advancing evidence-based decision-making at the local level. Because block grants are one of the biggest policy tools that are available. And if there are ways to bring more transparency beyond where grants are being made and the dollar amounts to how well is a program performed, then I think that is going to really help streamline the development of high-performing programs at the local levels. And just as an example, in one of my previous roles, the leadership actually built out an evidence library. It's kind of a database where we could see active database pilots across city, across departments. We could see what data points were being collected, what the objective of the program was, and the results. And so if we could do a search from that, we could actually contact that individual, or we could reach out and try to design a similar pilot, knowing ahead of time these are the data points that were needed. And that actually helped the city advance many more programs from a data perspective than we would have known on our own. So, bringing that transparency again around impact data or outcome data along a system and not just bringing in all these data sets into one system, I think would be really important as well. Ultimately, cities share the federal government's mission to fund effective programs and to really move away from tactical initiatives to more strategic shifts in policy. And data, I think, is the key to help cities move in that direction. So on the final slide, thank you. Ultimately, the key things for cities, because we're far removed in this chain of being cities, states, federal governments, and even international here, is I think ultimately to build the trust, the usage, and the adoption is the solutions need to be accessible. And by accessible, that just doesn't mean, it's available on a test site, but it could be the design, the interface, the accessibility from an ADA perspective for people who are colorblind, language translation, et cetera, and easy to navigate. Need to be equitable and intuitive so people are able to go into the system and not be intimidated. So if I'm a data person, I'm the only one who knows in the entire city how to navigate a system, and that's not really encouraging evidence-based decision-making across departments in the way we want it to. So that's really important as well. So I think, making sure that whatever data infrastructure is built out, whatever happens behind the scenes, at least a public-facing component of that interface, again, appears accessible and equitable and intuitive. And I think using these principles will not only help federal employees, but also help local cities as well. And that's it.
Well, thank you, David and Lila. We do have a few minutes for questions. My one comment is, I think we see the theme coming up again and again. Standards matter, definitions matter. Just at that basic level, making sure that we understand what we are actually measuring. And I know that one thing that that's put my own B hat on, we do kind of help set some of those standards, and sometimes, standards are not perfect, though. So it'd be an interesting discussion to move forward. It's like, well, there's a standard that will make your data more compatible, but it may not be what you actually would most want to measure out of it. And does it turn into some sort of multiple compatibility issue? So anyway, we're very sympathetic to standard setting and know some of the challenges with actually getting those adopted, even at the federal level after they're set here. So with that, I did want to open it up to the group for discussion. We do have about probably about 10 minutes of discussion, and I want to talk a few minutes about the next next few meetings. I will start with a public comment, because we always love those, and I will just read it out for the groups who may not hear it. The local perspective is more of a one-way relationship from top down. This is where evidence is most needed because it directly impacts population. I'd like to know how the presenters would make it a cross-relationship with state and federal, even neighboring municipal governments. So think about how locals can not be the recipient, but rather the full partners in creating and analyzing data.
I can jump in real quick here. So part of it is capacity. If you think about that town of over 10,000, 120 employees, I think I might have mentioned this last time, right? For these smaller communities, they're also experiencing the issue of brain drain, and retention, right? So if you look at the demographics of the federal government, apply that to the state government, and then it's even more acute in a lot of these smaller communities. So that's a starting point there. And then just you saw the pie chart of the service delivery. I think the challenge for local governments, this is what I'm talking to a lot of town or city mayors and council members about, is how do you upskill your existing workforce? This is what the private sector is doing. The public sector has to do it, whether they like it or not, in terms of accelerating, being able to do things virtually. I think once we were able to build out that capacity, I'm hoping it'll become a two-way street.
Great. Other comments from members in the panel? Again, a lot of excellent presentations today. Although it does focus on perhaps the very large task before us, right? Especially if you start thinking about the thousands of municipal areas that each have probably slightly different perspectives and needs on the use of data for evidence building.
Dom, it looks like Amy has a question.
Okay, great.
Hi. It seems like those were great presentations. Thank you so much for that. Listening to you and thinking about how the data are being used, and especially when there's a critical need like during the pandemic, it seems like there's a lot of information needed for tactical decision making. And I'm curious if you guys could talk a bit about how data being used for statistical purpose might interact with the data that you've already used for either compliance reporting or other descriptive statistics, especially if the statistical information is put through some sort of privacy preservation approach that might create slight differences in the numbers relative to what you might have already published for compliance purposes.
Lila, I'll turn this one over to you to start.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Amy. So we're definitely living through that right now. And, it's a great example of infrastructure we didn't know we needed and building out relationships in with our colleagues at the county where we didn't anticipate something like this. So we've had to really walk through manual exercises and looking at data, looking at how to combine some demographic information, but still preserving people's privacy needs. It's been challenging. One, because capacity, two, because of skill sets and knowledge, three, there's just no coordinated, comprehensive system that speaks to the county and to the city. So you're constantly sending like spreadsheets or PDFs. And so it's very inefficient when you're trying to make these tactical real-time decisions. And what we've tried to do is, or in the process of doing, is creating systems, protocols, and especially standards, again, that same word, on how in the future, if something were like this to come up, what are the things we'd want to collect? How are we going to share the data? Who's responsible for it? Who's going to share it out? And who's going to be part of a team to think about the impact or the varying impact of a crisis on different communities? That's been really the big part here in Dallas and in many communities is, the uneven nature of how different communities are being impacted and what we can do to really target those communities. And so with that, because we had to rely on maybe, again, some of the information from the federal level that's a little bit dated. Sometimes it's not an accurate read on the ground when we're going in and doing either outreach efforts or programmatic outreach efforts on the ground. And we have been trying to adjust when we get there to say, okay, this community has changed in this way, or now we have more of a mix of, let's say, essential workers in this community versus not. They might be out more. Therefore, they might have a higher risk of being exposed potentially because of their job, their occupation, or whatever their need might be to be outside their home or their inability to work from home, right? So we're trying to build out these personas of different groups who are facing the challenges of the pandemic in different ways, but it's definitely been an interesting way to try to design on the fly to address some of those needs. So hopefully that's helpful, Amy.
Okay, thanks. We have a couple, a comment or question from Chris Heflin and also Leonard Berman. So Chris, to you.
Just quickly, I think the metropolitan planning organizations typically have quite a bit of analytical capability. They tend to be engineers, sometimes transportation engineers, community planners that have skills in analyzing trends. So they may have potential for helping some of the smaller governments. And the other thing I'll just quickly observe, having spent about 15 years with the city government, that we had considerable data that's useful in early warning of economic trends, building permits, business licenses, things like that, that are much more sensitive or useful in projecting what's happening. That's it.
That's a great point, Chris. I do think cities can sometimes be leading indicators of either economic depressions or recovery, and certainly that's something that we're looking at now is how can we stand up some of those indicators and to measure that against, revenues that might be coming to a city, how quickly recovery can happen from a budgetary standpoint. And again, that might be useful to a state level and also to a federal level in terms of what that economic growth might look like in the future if we could get that granular and then really aggregate that data. So thanks for that point, Chris.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's always the challenge, right? To see where the trend is turning. But Leonard.
So this is a natural follow-up to Chris's point, which just, maybe something to come out of our effort would be a recommendation that the federal government fund consulting resources for state and local governments that want to expand access to data, and also serve as a clearinghouse, basically just to put together best practices from different government entities, so that governments that want to get into this line of business won't be reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, that's a great idea. One thought that came to mind is, like, for instance, we've been connecting a lot of smaller communities to state data centers, which they actually didn't know about. And, I don't think it's intentional, right? They didn't hear from even their state demographer, like, hey, you can call the state data center. Meanwhile, this was in March, April, and they were trying to call the Census Bureau in Suitland when everyone was switching to remote and no one had phone access. I mean, that's probably a whole other issue, right? But just having somebody who's relatively local who can help you, and then it would be great if the federal government could at least have a directory like, I'm a small town mayor, I just want to be able to look up these two topics. You know, can I get connected to the MPO, engineer that Chris alluded to? Can I talk to someone just about basic data analytics, right? I don't have the staff skill set. Can I borrow someone's, staff person for like a half day to do some analysis?
Yeah, and to piggyback off what David was saying, that I think large cities also face those kinds of challenges, because I can't tell you how many times I've tried to Google some cool case study that I've seen in another city and to try to find a contact, or try to find, what kind of data set were they collecting that really helped them build a case for a certain program to get past the legislative or budgetary process. So I know that's something we struggle with as well. One of the things we did put into place last fiscal year that I didn't mention from a capacity standpoint was a data academy. So even in surveying the employees within the city, we identified a group of a couple of hundred employees that were doing reporting-like or data-like tasks, even though they weren't called that or classified that in their job description, and work with a vendor to design skill sets that we saw would be really pertinent to taking the data out of these legacy systems, doing something more than just an Excel spreadsheet, report off a template, and really using that skill set and that training to build out a capstone project that they could then take back to their departments. So kind of a train the trainer model, where we did have them go through a training of about 60 hours, and it was everything from, the simplicity of like advanced Excel to visualizations. And then they were able to take that back to their departments and, be useful in real time almost immediately. And we wanted to actually extend the Data Academy to surrounding communities who are going to be smaller, because we're the largest jurisdiction in Dallas, and they could perhaps, pay a cost, but they wouldn't have to necessarily build up the Data Academy. They wouldn't have to design the curriculum, and they would be connected to a cohort experience. So if they did struggle and they are the only one in a very small city that's adjacent to Dallas, they could actually call upon that person when they hit a data barrier of some kind, and maybe build that community and help out people in other cities as well. So we are looking at ways to expand capacity, not only for ourselves, but, helping the communities around us as well.
Okay, great. We're close to the end, but certainly not close to the end of this general conversation. We heard a lot today about capacity building and standardization, and frankly, I think these last points were excellent ones. Just transparency, lifting the fog of who's working on what. I thought, David, you also made an excellent point about the trying to get municipalities kind of in some sort of network or information about similarly sized areas with similar goals. And so I guess even if you have capacity, in our thinking, it still would be incredibly useful to hear what other like municipalities are doing across the country. And so I thought that was another interesting point. I do want to, let's try to give, we're going to try to end on time here. So why don't I talk a little bit, and all of this will go on in the public comments, and we'll have the links, and so all this information will be available for you, and hopefully that this discussion has stimulated some of the feedback that we're looking for from the community that's listening in still, and could respond to the Federal Register notice with further discussions and thoughts about all these areas. I did want to spend a few minutes about what we're going to do in the next few meetings. So, just to give folks a preview, the January meeting, don't have the exact dates in front of me, but I'm sure that will be in the notification materials. We're going to hear more about the federal statistical system. So we heard a lot about other levels of government, but a lot of that did refer back to what the federal government was up to. And so we do have a very decentralized federal statistical system, and so I think that's going to be a fascinating conversation from some of our colleagues. We're also going to hear about federal evaluation and performance systems. So again, from colleagues who are familiar with all that. In February, we're going to hear from the CDOs, officially a relatively new position that was created by the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Bill 2018, but in practice, it's something that the federal government has been engaged in, the responsibilities and authorities for a long time. So we're going to hear how the CDOs have been organizing themselves, and we have the advantage of having the chair of the CDO Advisory Committee as part of this committee as well, Ted Kuok. And we're also going to hear from the external researchers and data about science in February. The March meeting, heard a lot about this today. We're going to take a little bit deeper dive into the what is probably one of the biggest barriers, not barriers, the biggest barriers in the sense of like, this is the reason why some things that someone might want to do, they can't do, but also striking the right balance in your privacy and confidentiality provisions is that it is absolutely probably one of the most, if not the most important aspect of trying to build a system where data is going to be shared across jurisdictions. So we're going to hear about the federal government's privacy and confidentiality issues and technologies for addressing it. Near and dear to our hearts is that OIRA does have the privacy function across the federal government as well. Hear a little bit more about data ethics. Again, very, very related and important issue, and I think that several presenters today talked about how really that impression of the big brother aspects of centralized data collection is actually like really thrown a wrench into some previous efforts to try to make progress on this issue. So I think ethics is absolutely an essential component here. And hopefully by March, I think probably our goal is to have synthesized and be able to discuss the public comments that we received by early February from the Federal Register and others. So that is the plan. And we are right on time. So unless anyone else has any thoughts, I'll give maybe a 10 or 15 seconds for someone to flag for me something that I forgot. And I also wanted to take another opportunity to thank all the presenters for the excellent presentation today. I learned a huge amount, and we were joking that we or maybe have a weekend project to click on all these wonderful data dashboard links that have been shared and to see the many ways in which folks have brought their data to life. So with that, why don't we consider this meeting officially adjourned? Thanks everyone, and have a great weekend and happy holidays. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.